Owning a house should be a realistic life goal. It's where you set down roots, where you raise a family, where you grow old. But young people hoping to buy their first home, just like their parents did a generation ago, are facing a tough housing market.
Liberal leader Justin Trudeau made a pitch today to people who are struggling to buy their first home. He says if elected, the Liberals would expand the first-time homebuyer incentive program that his government initially brought in. Under it, Canada's housing agency kicks in up to 10% of the purchase price of a home, bringing down the mortgage load for borrowers. It's kind of like an interest-free loan. Right now, you're only eligible if the home you want to buy is less than $480,000. Today, though, Trudeau said his government, again if elected, would raise that cap to $789,000 for people living in hot markets like Vancouver and the Greater Toronto Area. Trudeau also promised to target foreign buyers by introducing an annual 1% tax on homeowners who don't live in Canada. So how much would this help prospective home buyers? Paul Kershaw is a professor with the University of British Columbia's School of Population and Public Health, as well as founder and lead researcher of Generation Squeeze. He joins us from Vancouver. Nicole Wells is RBC's Vice President of Home Equity Financing, and she joins us from Toronto. Hi to both of you. Great to see you.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
Before we kind of analyze and scrutinize the potential solution proposed today, I wanted to kind of lay out for our viewers what the problem is. Mr. Kershaw, I'll start with you. How much of an issue is affordable housing in this country?
I would say that the housing challenges before younger generations are second only in importance to the climate challenges that we face in terms of sustainability. I mean, the reality is that for a young person today across this country, they need to save for about 13 years of full-time work to put together a 20% down payment on an average priced home. Back in the day when my mom started out, it took 5 years. And if you hone in on specific markets like the GTA, it would take 21 years, and in Metro Van, 29 years. It's really pushing home affordability ownership out of reach, and as a result, we're really expecting young people to adapt, and it's difficult to adapt so long as we don't articulate explicitly that we don't want home prices to continue to rise. And I think today actually was a good day for that.
Ms. Wells, let me ask you, Mr. Kershaw hit on the fact that it happens in specific markets even more so, like the problem is bigger in specific markets. If you were to identify those markets, where is the problem most acute?
Well, it's most acute in bigger centers like Toronto or Vancouver. So all the places where the Liberals are actually proposing to up the limits on this program. So that's where we see the most pressure.
And to follow up on upping the limits, what do you think of the proposal that they made today, and how much do you think it will help the problem?
Yeah, so I think any tool for first-time homebuyers to help relieve affordability is really good. On the other side, it's really in the details. So this is a campaign promise. There's no details around it at this point. But the amount that they're proposing is good. I think the concern I have is about they're not expanding the amount of dollars they're putting towards this program. So they capped it at $1.2 billion over 3 years, and every year it's $400 million. So the question would be is how far will those dollars go? Also, on top of it all, it's great that they have this option because not everybody has their parents to lean into to help finance. We know about 35% of Canadians actually lean into their family. So for those who don't, this is a good option. However, you need to think through the program and what it means to you. So there's a couple of complexities in here. First of all, it's not free money. You need to pay it back after 25 years or when you sell your property. And the thing that people have to be prepared for when it comes to this offer is the fact that it could be more or less, because it's dependent on the property value at that point in time. The other thing to think through is not only do you have you're actually reducing the amount of payment per month, but it's between roughly, we estimate about $120 to $350. So it's not a huge amount of money in these markets, but any little thing does help. But you also have to take into consideration that there's also a mortgage insurance premium. So at the end of this, you have to go through, make sure you're test driving your mortgage, making sure you're getting the right advice. Otherwise, at the end of the day, you could be surprised.
Mr. Kershaw, what's your analysis of the potential impact of this promise?
Well, I would disagree a wee bit with Nicole in saying that I don't think any help for first-time home buyers is actually a good thing. I think some parties are actually proposing, for instance, extending the amortization period and allowing a younger demographic to end up borrowing more, which not only exacerbates their debt levels, but then further fuels price escalation in homes. So actually, I'm part of an academic group that put out a framework for federal policy, federal platforms in advance of the election, and discouraging them from extending the amortization period, and I think the Liberals deserve credit for not doing that, while simultaneously trying to thread the needle to deliver some support, particularly in these very expensive markets. And so we know from CMHC that their shared equity approach will have a much more limited impact on price escalation than would changing the stress test for mortgages or changing the amortization period. So I think the federal Liberals deserve credit for trying to thread that needle, and it is a leveling up of the broader quality of our housing policy discourse than we've had at the national level.
Do you think, though, Mr. Kershaw, that the impact will be enough to make a big difference for people in the GTA, in Vancouver, where that price is just so high compared to, even Ottawa, let's say?
So, yeah, much higher than in Ottawa. So the reality is, no, there's no silver bullet for solving the housing crisis. There's got to be a bunch of silver buckshot. And today, actually, perhaps the more important buckshot that we saw would be the talk about how we dial down harmful kinds of demand that are ultimately inflating home prices beyond what young people can make in their local economies. And so, for instance, your reference to the new tax on speculators and foreign buyers that will kick in annually is actually a really important development. We've seen that to some degree in BC and in Ontario, but we should learn from those two provinces and ensure the problem doesn't spread anywhere else in the country. And so it's great to see a national party actually talk in this way, because at the end of the day, we make housing more affordable by not letting prices grow anymore and letting earnings catch up. And this was useful in that regard.
That tax on foreign ownership, Ms. Wells, is 1% annually, according to the Liberals' promise. Is that enough to discourage the practice?
Well, we saw an impact in BC and Ontario when they did that, but what happens if you don't do it unilaterally across the country? You just start to move the problem into, say, Quebec or East. And, just to respond to Paul there, I think that there's other ways that the government can actually start to influence this and help with savings. So, Paul, you mentioned, it takes 13, 20 years for consumers to save. Well, I think it does, and I agree with you. It takes a number of bullets, but the government hasn't looked at savings programs, introducing a registered house savings program, something that takes away from the need for consumers to always rely on credit and mortgage default insurance. The program is good. I like the tool. I like the program, but it's not big enough to solve the problem, because one of the problems is really about surplus and supply. And I'm a big advocate of savings and getting that discipline, because when we do research with consumers, you're talking about 40% of people who feel at one point or another house poor. It's a big shift to go through, and no matter what you do or what the size of your down payment is, shifting from no home to a home is a big move. So looking at savings programs, looking across the spectrum, making sure that these programs can have an impact in the markets is really important, and things that are easily explained to consumers, because the home buying process is hard. It's complex to people. We hear it every day, and that's why you need the expertise, the advice around it. It's not something that you just walk in and buy off the street like a can of Pepsi.
Mr. Kershaw, you're nodding there.
Well, I definitely agree that we didn't see a panacea to our housing problems today. The first-time homebuyers program is useful. It's better than we've had in the past, but no, it's not going to entirely solve the problem. And ultimately, we need to have policy that wants to keep these prices stable and maybe even dipping so that earnings can catch up, because savings is so much more challenging for a younger person today. Back in the day when my mom started out, the average price of a home was about 4 times greater than full-time earnings for a typical young person. Now it's like 10 times across the country. So savings is just so much more challenging, and really the solution comes in trying to address the price inflation. And I really think the focus on supply of housing is something that we haven't yet heard about from the Liberal platform. I think one really inexpensive thing they could do is say, hey, any transfer to a municipal government that we make for housing or infrastructure, that needs to be tied to, at least in cities, those cities meeting density targets, so that we start using our residential land more efficiently and not privileging single detached zoning where NIMBYism often gets in the way of adding the mixed housing that would start to price younger folks back in.
Ms. Wells, final question to you. You kind of touched on it, but the idea, and I feel like as someone in that group, you kind of get these mixed messages like, don't take on too much debt. We know that's the reason that the mortgage rules were made more strict in the first place, but then at the same time, it gets too hard to afford anything, or to not even afford it, to be able to purchase anything. How difficult is it for various parties to navigate that balance when they're making these kinds of promises?
Well, it can be challenging. I mean, a lot of people make a lot of good income, but they don't necessarily have the practices in place to save. So part of what consumers need to think about is when they're buying a home, and I think over the past few years, people have been worried about house pricing moving up and jumping in, and maybe not spending the time they need to think about, what does this mean to my life? What does it mean down the road? So when you think about that home, all you see is, well, I want my independence, I'd love to live there, it looks beautiful, but they haven't test drove what a mortgage looks like, or what, not even just the mortgage itself, but the actual cost of home buying itself, right? So there's taxes. What happens if your roof, taxes, there's all those things. So working through an appropriate budget and doing that beforehand, before you start to decide, am I ready for home, really, really important.
I guess my question is more from the policy point of view, though, in that I get the onus on, of course, on the individual, but yeah. Is there a role for the government? I mean, maybe there isn't, but is there a role? I'm sure Mr. Kershaw would argue there is, but is there a role for the government in aiding that process?
I think so. I mean, we help. The government helps us save through registered plans all the time. I think they should think about how they help consumers save. I mean, parents, like I said, spend a lot of time supporting their kids, and they have to make a decision. Parents have to make a decision what they take away from their nest egg and how that will actually impact them. There's a lot of pressure on parents to help their children buy that home. So it's not just about the first-time home buyer, it's about the family, the generations. So how do we start if the government wants to create a policy or a registered savings plan towards it or something along those lines, that would be very beneficial for consumers.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but I really appreciate the insight from both of you this evening, and hopefully we can have you back to check in on when the other parties make their specific promises on housing as well. Thank you very much to both of you. Paul Kershaw of Generation Squeeze and Nicole Wells of RBC. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.